This year marks the 50th birthday of your favourite Sunday World newspaper. To celebrate, we're looking back over some of the front page stories and the scandals with the big name journalists who made it the people's paper. So join us to reel in the years over the coming weeks on Crime World and at a special 50th birthday party event to be held on September 27th at the Sugar Club in Dublin. We have 50 tickets to give away. For information on how to enter, go to our Crime World social media channels on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. Sunday World is 50, a Crime World special. We were just discussing there where to start, and we have kind of agreed the best place to start is with that catchphrase, or the phrase, the marketing phrase that came out, "The world is watching," and what it was all about, what was the idea behind it, and what was the point in time that came about.
Yeah, the world is watching. Yeah, that was kind of our mantra in the Sunday World, I guess, for a particular period in the paper's history. Yeah, I'm gonna say it was in around 2010. There was a couple of kind of twin earthquakes happened in terms of the newspaper and in terms of crime reporting, I'd say around about 2010. And one of them is in, the life of the Sunday World itself. So we, at the time, we had a big challenge from maybe an opposition paper that should not be named, I suppose.
News the World.
News the World, Nicola, yeah. So Rupert Murdoch, News the World and all that. So they made a big pitch in around about 2010 to literally they were going around town saying we're going to be the Sunday World, we're going to steal the Sunday World clothes.
They were a huge animal with a huge amount of money behind them. I mean, you were competing against, this was, while the Sunday World was very much entrenched in Irish society then, just trying to think 2010, it was coming up to 40 years in existence at that stage.
Yeah.
So, it was a very powerful brand, but the News of the World had clout, it had money, it had vast amounts of money behind it.
Oh, no doubt. This is one of the biggest newspapers in the world. It's with the deepest pockets in the world, with Rupert Murdoch's kind of war chest. And they made a very specific, play in Ireland, which they were entitled to do. But it did revolve at the time around, the whole crime scene. And they hired, obviously, various people from who had previously worked with the Sunday World.
They poached Paul Williams, the biggest name in crime at the time.
And I remember it was said at the time it was there was about €1 million behind this in terms of advertising and in terms of everything else and resources, and that probably wasn't far off the mark at the time, to be honest. So it was a huge kind of challenge to us to see what would we do. What would we do to that? And I remember, I think, having a conversation with yourself, and I think you wisely said, "No, well, I'm not." Were you going to be next in line, as it were, as the crime editor of the Sunday World? But at the time, you would have been, and still are, I suppose, the investigations editor, which was a different brief.
Yeah.
And I think wisely, probably at the time, you said, "No, I'm not going to, just go head to head and do that." So, which I think was that is what sort of started us down a different kind of path, I think, and in my memory of it anyway, which was, well, we won't play this on their terms then, we'll play it on our own terms, which was to then assemble, various groups, a group of people, which we then termed sort of a crime desk of people. So we had, yourself was there, obviously. We had people like Niall Donald, familiar to this parish, the likes of Alan Sherry, who would end up at the Regency. People like that came on board.
Was
my name and
McCaffrey
Dylan was there.
Stage, or was he?
Mick McCaffrey would have been one of the others. He came a little bit later than that, all right. But again, that was what we were doing. We were kind of deciding we would have a sum of the parts kind of approach and take a totally different approach. And that's what, circle back to the world is watching. That was kind of the theme then that we settled on. We had all these people, all very experienced, very good crime reporters, general reporters, doing different aspects of that kind of whole beat. And the theme that seemed to pull it all together was this idea, which in my mind was an old school Sunday World legacy, that the Sunday World could pop up anywhere, anytime, any part of Ireland. That's what we would have prided ourselves a little bit on, that we were watching. You never know, people used to joke about it, the Sunday World jumping out of a hedge at you if you were up to no good, that kind of idea. And it went all the way back with me to a picture that to me summed up the Sunday World, or the attitude of it, when I was trying to work there, and we were trying to follow the tradition or the history of the paper. And there's a famous picture of Liam O'Connor, who's an old photographer you'll have worked with in the Sunday World, outside the forecourts in Dublin, going back to the 1980s. And he has his camera out, but he has has a fist in his face, a hand in his face. You'll know the picture.
Yeah.
And the guy he's trying to photograph is Mikey Dunn, one of the Dunns, so one of the original crime lord, one of the original crime families in Dublin. And that, was the sort of tradition and the legacy that we were trying to follow in the Sunday World in 2010. And that was the notion, well, the world is watching. So you never know where we're going to pop up or what we're going to do was the idea. And we had all this.
But it's an amazing marketing phrase, really, when you think about it. Like, it was incredible. I mean, it's the kind of thing that people would pay consultants millions and millions of euros to come up with.
Our old
whole
friends,
concept of
the
it.
Consultants, yes. Yeah. Well, no, I must invoice somebody consultancy fees, as that's kind of de rigueur these days, for that. But I'm not going to. I can't remember the exact origins of it. I'm sure it was something we bounced around between a few people. It may have been something that I came up with. I'm not sure, but it did sort of capture it, and we had kind of a whole campaign around it, and it had a kind of a pair of eyes that would look out at a poster from you. And the idea was, which is what the Sunday World did very well and still does, that idea that we were in communities, we were there with people. We were on the side of the people, the people's paper, and we were watching these things, what was going on. And I mean, it's a marketing slogan on one level, but it's also, it was kind of what we were about,
And it fed into other famous aspects of the newspaper as well, including Pub Spy. I mean, that famous sort of column that has existed for probably since the beginning.
Oh,
maybe,
I would say day one. Correction, but I think
day
one. It was. It was that we talk about strokes of marketing or newspaper genius. That was certainly one of them. Yeah.
This invisible, unknown entity would go into a pub, would have a few pints, and would come back out with reports about, the hygiene of the toilets, the general.
Famously. Well, the Pub Spy and his commandos, as it was styled, it took on a particular type of the way it was written was very clever from the early days. It was this spy and his commandos going into all these little towns, pitching up in God knows where, and from Longford to Leitrim, but it was a great mystery about it. I remember working in local newspapers myself down in Westmeath, and if Pub Spy came to town and was in the Sunday World, it was then a follow-up story in the local paper and the local radio.
Yeah.
And it's funny that you mentioned it with in the context of the world is watching. Yeah, it's a similar kind of philosophy, I guess. But at one point when we were doing that same World is Watching campaign, you may recall this, we had a van going around the town, and it was all, liveried up with the eyes, as I was describing there, looking out at you from the van. But it also had Pub Spy kind of down the side of it. And I think it was parked outside somewhere, possibly in Lahinch, I'm going to say, in Clare one day. Somebody had just borrowed the van and taken it away, but they arrived back out from having a drink outside in the pub to find a note on the windscreen wiper saying, "Some spy you are." So
I was going to say, wouldn't have been a Jeep we would have necessarily taken on any of our jobs out.
No, we kind of learned that quickly enough that we needed sort of different kind of vehicles on the road when you were doing the more serious end of the stuff. Yeah, but I mean, the world is what I mean. It's to me. It's that, it's that doorstepping kind of mentality. That's what we were trying to do. All newspapers do it, but in an Irish context, nobody was quite, doing it as much or as often as the Sunday World, I guess. And it ran, at the total spectrum of kind of skullduggery, if you will, from, not just criminality, but corporate and political and even, celebrity wrongdoings. The notion was that we would pop up anywhere, any week with a kind of a doorstep and asking people questions and exposing various things that were going on. So, I mean, we had all sorts of people in there. This is 2010, so the banking crisis was in full flight as well. I remember the likes of Donald McIntyre popping up on the 18th green in front of Sean Fitzpatrick. There was that kind of stuff. There was, Bertie Ahern, I'm sure, got the treatment. One of my own favourites was Thierry Henry, who we famously sent somebody to speak to after the infamous handball incident with a 6 foot high apology to the Irish nation. And the beauty of the art of the doorstep is captured in that picture, at the look on Thierry Henry's face as he finds this Sunday World reporter outside his mansion in the Spanish Hills. So that was the kind of the notion of it. And obviously then the more serious and the darker kind of end of that as well, at the criminal side of things.
In a way, it was a new era for the Sunday World because, and what sparked it was Paul Williams going to that rival newspaper that was coming in with a promise of, a war chest behind it and intent to take over the market as such. But like that, what led up to it was Williams was an excellent crime journalist. I mean, he was second to none, and had a decade of front pages, or probably more than that, in the Sunday World. Had done some amazing investigative journalism, and was almost, he was the most famous face of the Sunday World. So it was a devastating loss when he was moving on, and a big, huge challenge. Like, I mean, in the lead up to that, was there a sort of a belief that there was no Sunday World without Paul Williams, that one person was sort of what encompassed the whole paper?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was certainly the belief in the people who were, who were hiring him over, and there was a belief that was, if you did that, you could sort of then assume or become the Sunday World. We certainly didn't believe that, and I think good and all as a reporter as Paul was, and some of the stories were legendary back in their day, going back to the Father Michael Cleary scoops and things like that. But the crime reporting done through all the 90s and the Gilligan years was kind of real cutting edge. It was agenda setting stuff, there's no doubt. But yeah, there probably was a perception elsewhere that that if you hired Paul, maybe that then you could become the Sunday World. But as I say, I think the Sunday World was more than that. It was embedded into Irish culture, society, and Irish culture at every level. As I said, that kind of notion that at a parish level you'd pop up, as pubs boy, or somebody jumping out of a hedge. I mean, I'm always reminded of the Christy Moore, the original lyrics to Christy Moore's famous Liz Doon Varna, which is like a celebration of all human life, certainly a celebration of all things Irish and all Irish life. And in the middle of it, in the original lyrics, there's a name check for the Sunday World, and that was just the kind of thing that you just would not know where the Sunday World would pop up. And its roots, those roots in Irish society and in, both rural and urban communities, I think, where its actual real strength, that was the Sunday World more than Paul, more than me, more than you, more than anybody, more than any one person. And I mean, when we were looking at the 40th anniversary, which seems only 5 minutes ago, one of the original news editors, Sean Boyne, I remember, wrote a piece for us, and he summed it up from the early days. They articulated this as an actual policy that they would write for readers and not write for other journalists. And I mean, because other journalists at the time were telling them they were mad to launch this paper and it wasn't going to last and that kind of stuff. So, but they were very, very from the outset, very kind of connected to communities, be they Ballymun or be they Ballymahan and Longford or whatever. But so it always had that sense of itself and sense about it in my mind. And much as that was a huge challenge at that time, we talked about the money in the campaign that went into it. I don't think we were ever in any doubt that the paper was stronger than any one individual. And as I say, then we went about this process of having what we call a crime desk instead of a crime reporter, and it seemed to work.
Like only 2 years, I think, before that, you and I had sat down for lunch, and I had been years out. What would you call it? Sort of out of the loop, I suppose. I'd been running a news agency, which was all about making money and very little about, suppose digging deep into investigative journalism. It was very quick turnaround stories, and myself and Lynn Callagher were running it for years. We had done very well out of it, but it kind of had its time, and I was looking to come back into proper journalism, as I'd call it. And we'd had a lunch, and
it was a lunch. Yeah.
It was a lunch with some wine, which gave me the courage to seal the deal with you. But and of course, we went way back. We were in college together. We've been friends for years and years, decades now. But I had only started really in the Sunday World, and I remember coming in being so bloody nervous because I was looking at this paper and these stories they had, and these mad sort of up close and personal profiles of criminals and everything, and I was going, how the name of God am I going to do it? And you said something to me like, Asher, be just 10 splashes a year is all we're expecting now. It'd be nothing to you. And I nearly died. I had to just take down the glass of wine and go,
I was trying to tone it down with 10. It was probably closer to 20. I was hoping for it, but I didn't want to scare you off from the start, because it was probably about the fifth or sixth time I think I'd asked you to take a job at that stage, was it?
Probably, yeah.
So, so if it wasn't for the Santa Rita Boulevard, as we used to refer to some of the wine lunches, maybe you would have said no. But I mean, at that time, I had no doubt. I think I said it to you. I think you mentioned this somewhere recently when writing about it, that I said, well, it wouldn't be any bother to you. So, I mean, I think that was fairly prescient, as it turned out, But a paper like that and the type of stories that it was doing and breaking, it can seem like, Jesus, how do you how do you get in here and do this? Because there was people working at the top of their game, certainly a lot of people. But I think I think you fitted right in probably there.
Well, I was only there a couple of years really, and then we started this new campaign, and there was this. It felt like there was this whole new drive. And all sorts of different ways into reporting on things. And actually, a lot of the time when you mentioned the banking crisis, I did a lot of stuff around that.
You were, and by design and by choice, the investigations editor as opposed to the crime or gangland crime, I guess. And there was an awful lot going on in those days in that field. I mean, you were chasing people like Michael Fingleton, was it? Who had cost the taxpayer serious amounts of money, and or one of my personal favourites, if we want to talk doorsteps, was when you went down to Tipperary on the trail of a certain Michael Lowry, and much as you think, various criminals have come up with cunning plans to dodge the press and dodge the chasing pack. We'd never seen the one that Michael Lowry pulled, which was to step into a complete stranger's house and close the curtains on you. You might recall that, but all of that kind of stuff. I just got
my first ever iPhone and managed to video it on the wrong way round. The wrong way round.
Yeah.
The one that you were always told not to do it that way. Because it was sort of narrow, but still.
Landscape
That was a Saturday. And, obviously the stories came in, the most exciting stories would have come in on a Saturday for the front page on the Sunday. And the Lowry story was something to do with a town that I'll never forget the name of, Gortnahu,
very good.
Tipperary.
Yeah.
And that there was some ghost estates down there, and Larry's connection to it was something to do with land or whatever. He was very connected to it anyway, and I wanted to ask him some questions about it and about why these estates had been left idle and all the rest of it. And he did behave so peculiarly. Over 2 days, myself and Ernie went and tried to he was a politician. You'd expect him to stop and just say, I don't have any comment to make on that. Instead, he played this game with us. He used to open the gates of his house and take off in his big fancy car, and we'd take off after him.
It was like he was enjoying it a bit, yeah.
I'd say he was enjoying it a bit. And eventually tracked him down. We were actually about to head home, and I saw him walking past me on the street, and I think I just pulled the car in, got out, managed to hit video on the phone somehow, even though anyone who knows me knows I'm not very technically, that was luck.
iPhone is idiot proof.
Well, maybe. And I called after him, and he just ran away from me into this housing estate and went into, some man was out gardening, and he went into the open door of his, and slammed the door shut.
And patio door and pulled the curtains.
Yeah. And I just stood there in shock. The man who was gardening, whose house it was, went up to the door, went to open it, and Larry sort of tried to slam the door shut and then sort of grabbed him and pulled him into the house.
Yes.
And then the man rang me and said, oh, Michael Larry's invited into my house. It was very peculiar, very funny. The video's still out.
But I mean, as to I think, some people would say, oh, what do you, what's the point of some of these kind of stories or doorsteps or whatever. Now, there was a serious story behind that one. But to my mind, that notion of doorstepping these, self-important people, not just Michael Larry, but it bursts that bubble that they exist in of self-regard and self-importance, and at the more sinister end of the scale, then this bubble of fear and intimidation that they like to surround themselves with. So the notion that this guy has to run into somebody's house and close the curtains, it's faintly ridiculous, but it does I think achieve that kind of aim of just taking these people down a peg or two, and it's that whole doorstep notion, that world is watching notion, that you're going to pop up and people are not prepared for it, when you're catching people with their pants down. That was the the Sunday World way, and it can be in a slightly more light-hearted fashion, or that's ultimately the same kind of idea when you're doorstepping some of these serious criminals and trying to strip away this aura tactics, of untouchability that they like to have.
And I suppose around that time, 2010 and onwards, for the next 5 to 10 years, while there was some of the doorsteps were funny, they were on golf courses, they were these bankers, they were developers, they were all this, but it did turn dark very quickly, and it was the era of the Kinahan cartel. I mean, May 2010 was the first supposed takedown of the organisation by Europol, a failed attempt to dismantle them, which would ultimately empower them to become bigger and more sinister and just, richer and everything. I wanted to ask you, like, from your perspective, you're the guy in charge, you're steering the ship, you're sending people out on these jobs, you're working out how to go about trying to run stories on these mafias, essentially. Like, how do we, I suppose, come up with ways and means to apply that doorstep to an arena where it is so incredibly dangerous, where there's guns and there's there's spotters and you're in a foreign country and
there was I think I said at the start there was the two twin earthquakes in terms of news and newspapers in 2010. That was the second one, was that Operation Shovel happened, and said, well, we'd assembled all these kind of various reporters. All of a sudden, you wanted something for them to do. Here it was, because the Kinahans had always been there, and Daniel Kinahan had appeared very early on in the Sunday World, and as had Christy Kinahan, and been named the Dapper Don, I think, in the Sunday World by Paul Williams. But there was a sense that through the 90s it was all about John Gilligan and the Gilligan mob, and then the noughties were largely Limerick and Crumlin and Drimna and these kind of things. So they kind of, went along slightly under that radar in terms of getting that full focus of the likes of the Sunday World. But 2010 changed all that, certainly changed it forever. Yeah, it became apparent that even in our kind of wildest estimations, when you're talking about drug empires and you're getting figures from various people and intelligence, and you're wondering how accurate they are, but the sheer scale and ambition of what was exposed by Operation Shovel to us, really showed us that here was the first bona fide Irish mafia cartel. Remember we had people out in Brazil looking at some of these properties that they weren't fully built at the time, but that were exposed by Operation Shovel when the Kinahans were taken down that time you refer to. But it just showed the sheer scale and ambition of the greed that was there at the heart of that, and so that was mirrored in the drug empire. But as to how then it becomes obvious that a paper like Sunday World has to cover a story like that and has to do it, and these guys weren't in Dublin. Well, they were scattered throughout Dublin with various kind of, I suppose, branches of the operation in Dublin, but then they were based, as we know, in Spain on the Costa del Sol. So, quickly we had to sort of, we were still in the midst of this kind of, tabloid war as well, I guess, with the opposition. So we were very conscious of that, and we were conscious that we had to cover the story, but that we had to learn very quickly how to operate in places like that and how to do it safely. And at the heart of everything is safety. Nothing is worth anybody getting hurt, as we often say in the business. So there was a lot of learning as we go. I think you might recall, but we certainly put in place, a lot of expertise. We spoke to a lot of people. We took a lot of precautions. You plan these things. You plan, your way in. You plan your way out, as you know, and that doesn't always go to plan, as sometimes happened as well at a later stage when we did the kind of probably the major kind of operation that we did, or sting, if we can call it that, on the Kinahans in around about 2013. But so you're assembled. As I said, we'd assembled a lot of experienced and very, very good people who knew what they were doing. You're hugely dependent on the research and intelligence that you can get. You're not going anywhere, hopefully, into the dark. You're researching things like addresses and who's there. You're always conscious that you're probably being watched, as transpired in your case in 2013. Which that could have taken a dark turn at that stage, but the precautions that were there in place probably we fell back on.
Yeah,
you may recall, more about that. But so I mean that's kind of the approach to it, I guess. But at all times, you're
trying to get up. You're getting up as close as possible without getting bitten. Really, isn't that it? You're just trying to get as close as possible to get. And the point of it, of course, is, and you referred to 2013 when a team went out to Portabanús, out into the Kinahan organisation. They had reassembled at that point. Europol told us they were dismantled, they were over and done with. They were not. We were getting more and more reports back to Dublin that they were back together. They were more powerful than ever on the Costa. That they were back in the business, they were back in the game. And sure enough, we went out to sort of see the environment. I mean, the point of doing that is, it's not voyeurism. It's not to go out and take a picture of a fancy car. I suppose it's to show, well, in my mind, it's to show what this misery, I suppose, is funding for the chosen few at the very top table. And by trying to get as close as possible to the lifestyle they're living, for me, it was always, I remember when we were, myself and McCaffrey were posing as a couple from Dublin interested in buying an apartment.
Yeah, Nigel and
Trish is what we called ourselves. So we did have a bit of a laugh at it as well, I suppose, but we wanted to get as close as possible to Christy Kinahan, where he had been arrested, to this very fabulously exclusive place he was living in Estepona, where you just couldn't wander in. So we had to set up to see a few properties to claim we were interested in buying them. But for me, the point of that was that Christy Kinahan had played the system so long. I mean, way back to when he was first arrested and jailed in Dublin, he had stood up in court and told the judge that he had a drug problem and that he'd begged him for leniency and said that he wanted to get an education behind bars. And he had done that. The taxpayer had funded his education, his degree, whatever he got. He learned his languages. He actually stayed in prison famously longer than he needed to because he wanted to finish his education. And with that education and with that chance that we gave him as a society, because of the systems we have, he went out and created a mafia, which made him fabulously wealthy, which resulted in the loss of, we don't know how many lives, but a lot. And all the misery and the tragedy that goes with that.
Yeah, and all the misery. The thing that always strikes me about the Kinahans is it's happening in their own community. This kind of Oliver Bond area, if you like, is almost one of the ground zeros of the epicenters of the misery that they're causing, and that's to the point of showing them in their with their pants down in their backyard where they don't like to be seen. They like to be seen when they come back home. And they swan around a little bit, but that notion of getting up close and personal with them, in their backyard where they're spending their money, where they're flashing all the wealth. And I mean, I used to think sometimes it was a myth that some of these gangsters were making so much money because you see them in Dublin, and most of them, 90% of them, would stay in Dublin, and they stay in these compounded areas in kind of the communities they grew up in. So it was unusual. The Kinahans were unusual in that sense, unusual that we got to sort of photograph them. They were, like the movie cliche, spending the money and buying the mansions and all that kind of stuff. So it was important to show people in these kind of streets and communities where the drug problem was causing all the carnage, that this is where the money goes. Here they are spending the money, and that the culmination of that particular job being, I think I'm right in saying, possibly the only time Christy Kinahan Senior was ever photographed outside of the confines of a court where you can safely approach people, and he was photographed at his favourite sushi restaurant in Portabanús down at the port there, and I'm fairly certain when he saw that he wasn't too happy. And again, it's it shows that this aura and this kind of bubble of invincibility, of untouchability, it pricks that a little bit, it takes them down a peg or two, it embarrasses them, but it shows them here they are in their natural kind of habitat, and in a way that they don't want to be seen.
There's a bit of a rush though too, isn't there, to get one over on them? I mean, you know what I mean? There is that, you get that picture. I'm sure when that picture landed home, there was a a sense of absolute achievement, and you just knew that was just going to be a wipeout.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, you know it from, when you're on the road and on the ground, it's even more intense, I guess, than being, back in the office. But there's no sweeter kind of, beer you might have at the end of a job than once the job is done and once something like that is in the can and everyone is, more importantly, safely out of there, and you're back to somewhere where you're out of the firing line, and you sit back and have a drink. You know that feeling. So,
do you think it's a mad job?
Mad job? No, I don't think it's. Well, I mean, your particular end of it is probably something that a lot of people would think is a bit mad. All right, yeah. I mean, I do think you have to be almost born to it. I don't think you can fall into that without having a certain sort of makeup. I'm not entirely sure what the parts of that often are, but. You do need that sort of. I think the biggest part of it is to me. I mean, and I'm often a lot of my career has been sort of back in the HQ, if you will, but it's all driven by this kind of chip you have on your shoulder about injustice and these kind of bullies that swagger their way around the world, whether they be in the corporate world or the political world, and ultimately, the ultimate school bully is the criminal. So. I think if you're driven by a sense of that, I don't think you see it as mad. I think you see it as something that very valuable and something worth doing. Certainly, it's a very kind of rewarding job, I would say. A bit mad, yeah.
Yeah, and the Sunday World, I suppose. What impact do you feel it's had? What impact does it have nowadays in this changing world we're in? We're both doing very different jobs now than when we started out. Do you feel it has a place for the next, few decades? I don't know how long we can look into the future, or if at all we can in the media. But, it's 50 years a survivor, the Sunday World. And is it still packing a punch?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said, don't work there anymore, so I'm not sure whether it's for me to say. Certainly, there's a role for that kind of campaigning and crusading style of paper that it started out as. There's a role to be, the voice. The voice of the people. Certainly, still, I think, but the media world has changed so drastically. And so in so many ways since certainly that 50 years, it's hard to credit, but a lot of people would have said at the outset that it wasn't going to last 50 days, I think. So it certainly has made an impact, all the stories over the years that there's a legacy there alone. As I say, this legacy of taking people down a peg or two, exposing the kind of things that have gone on in some of the drug gangs in the communities. I mean, that's an important legacy that's there. I think that work is certainly, somebody will continue it on, somebody will have to carry it on. I don't know.
Somebody a lot younger than me.
None of us know where these kind of brands and platforms, as they call them these days, go. Will go, or what they'll be in a few years' time, I guess.
But you've brought a lot of what we had in the Sunday World to your new role in the Star and the Mirror. I mean, I can sometimes absolutely know exactly what you're going to do with something. I know exactly what you're going to do with it. You know what I mean?
I wish you'd tell me sometimes. And it's, I thought myself till 11:30. Yeah.
I think that sort of world is watching thing has probably followed you a little bit into those other media, and you still have an ability to send on a story and get that reward, which is something special and unique.
Yeah, well, people have often said that to me in the Star and the Mirror these days. Other journalists would say, yeah, we've kind of, we're one of the last few people still maybe sending people to various jobs in various parts of the world, which is great. And that's to do with the people higher up the chain than me who back us in doing that. And we've people just back from Lebanon and places like that, and we have gone in search of various people, all right, in the last while. But I think that's a hugely important part of the job. It becomes more difficult, as you know, with resources and so on. I think your famous line, whenever we said, well, how much is it going to cost, was just a job. Well, 20 grand, that's all you need.
25.
Hang on a second, it might only cost about 3 or 4. No, 20 grand, that was it. So once you had 20 grand in the budget, you were good to go. But, but no, I mean, it is an important point about how media is developing and how the revenues and resources and so on that have been sucked out of media by the likes of Google and Facebook and dare I say maybe even RTE, but that kind of money may not be there if somebody wants to go out and do the likes of the stuff that we did in 2013 in Spain, and these guys, as we know, are going deeper and deeper into parts of the world where it's harder to follow.
Very much so.
It's very hard to operate in places like Dubai or, God knows where they pop up next, or in some of these kind of African countries. So, I mean, there is an important point.
They're going out of reach of us too, really, aren't they? Now that you mentioned
there's a lot of black spots developing in the media world because of resources.
I mean, even Turkey. I mean, how comfortable would you be sending somebody out to Turkey to try and in a country where so many journalists have been in prison for nothing?
Yeah, I mean the toll on journalists and the attacks on them and the assassinations of journalists in some part of the world, as we know, is always kind of going up and up.
Yeah.
And again, to our point is that when we were looking at trying to be safe and going out to jobs, you wouldn't go into a territory where you thought you couldn't be safe and you couldn't have all those kind of checks and balances. So I mean, it is difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're out of reach, maybe in a way, in a small way. But then again, we know that whatever else is going to happen, that Kinahan story, which, I mean, I feel sort of started in the Sunday world back in the day, but it's going to continue through all media over the next, really, there's still probably another 4 or 5 years, I think, before it comes to its conclusion.
I think that we used to do the Godfather analogies, and that the gangsters are fans of the gangster movies as well, and the Godfather and that, but the culmination of the Godfather trilogy, as we know, happens in the opera in Sicily, and I think I've often said before, one thing that struck me when you talk about the papers like the Sunday World, and he will carry on these kind of stories, but it was only in very recent times, I think, that what we might call the broadsheet media caught up and caught on to that story. For a long time, people would have been sniffy and snooty enough about it and would have been saying to the likes of us, this is all kind of hyperbole and, tabloid exaggeration. And then all of a sudden they woke up one morning to realise, what a story they had in their hands, with the kind of boxing connections, and all of a sudden you had the American government coming in and putting 5 million rewards on the heads of these people, and these guys were scrambling to catch up, and all of a sudden the Kinahans go up and being in the Sunday World, being in the New York Times. So I mean, there is that kind of it's kind of coming, the sort of climax of the story. You get that sense that it's coming, and I think back to the opera in Sicily, I think the fat lady is tuning up to sing, but the tabloids and the Sunday World and the likes of the Star and the Mirror will certainly be there when the fat lady does sing, I think, but the rest of the media has certainly woken up to the big story that's there.
We'll be there for the final chapter. Well, Neil Leslie, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.